So what did we learn from Ford?
Yeah, there was a lot of concern about, coming into this report. GM had just warned of as much of a $5 billion impact. $2.5 billion for Ford is, of course, a much less of a hit and maybe not a huge shock because the company, produces about 80% of what it sells in the U.S. And yet this is a substantial hit for the company and speaks to just how much the parts supply chain issues are a major aspect of how and why this is going to impact the industry and impact some of the end manufacturers, where even if 80% of what you sell in the country is made in the country, the parts supply chain is so diversified, so globalized that even as Ford takes some steps to sort of mitigate this, it's really going to deliver quite a blow to their bottom line this year.
I'd imagine for Ford and GM and all the other auto companies, it's difficult to even exactly pinpoint exactly how much the damage is, given that tariff policy has been changing rapidly with the relief to stacking tariffs for autos last week. Craig, do we understand whether these are conservative estimates, whether they are worst case estimates for the companies?
I think if you were to sort of get an honest thought about that from Dearborn, Michigan, it would be very much a wild guess, a sort of sticking your finger in your mouth and putting it up in the air. This is an issue of day-to-day negotiation with the White House, and the fact that, to your point, this has been changing so rapidly, and we've had sort of things put on, taken off, or taken off only sort of halfway. There's a lot about how these tariffs on parts are going to be applied. That's really complicated. And I would point out, even when you talk about steel and aluminum tariffs, it may be the case that Ford sources quite a bit of its steel and aluminum within the U.S. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to escape cost increase, because these tariffs are raising the cost of procuring steel and aluminum in the U.S. And so even if there's not a sort of direct impact here from the tariffs, there are these sort of knockdown effects and second order effects. They're also going to have an effect on Ford and their results for this year.